What if being in the wrong place didn't just mean a bad day or a missed train, but a destiny so final it erased you from the map? What if a single miscalculation, a single gesture of desperation, or an ecological collapse turned ordinary people into footnotes, skeletons under fields, or names swallowed by bureaucracy? Today we're going through 3 of history's most horrific destinies, moments when being in the wrong place at the wrong time stopped being an accident and became a fate. A quick warning before we begin. Some of these stories involve violence and human loss. I'll be deliberate and respectful in the telling, and I'll flag when the record is uncertain. If that's not something you want to hear, take care of yourself now. This episode is brought to you by a sponsor who helps fund these deep dives into dark corners of the past. If you like getting the full story, context, caveats and all, check the link in the description to support the channel and get early access to bonus material. Imagine surrendering with 200,000 others, then being ordered to dig your own grave. The first story I want to tell begins not with a single desperate man or a lone wolf of a predator, but with empires. For most of human history, the rise and fall of giant polities has produced the most prosaic terrors: starving civilians, forced marches, and executions on an industrial scale. The episode I'm about to describe is set against that backdrop, the chaotic, bloody era before a single dynasty tried to turn 7 warring states into one empire. The scene: a fractured land where kingdoms warred for power and survival. A ruler, whose personal name is indefinido in the sources we have here, pulled together a program to unify the realm. He reformed the law, standardized weights and measures, and imposed brutal discipline across conquered territories. His methods worked. His state became a model of order, but order came with a cost: paranoia, harsh punishments, and a system that crushed dissent with efficiency. When that ruler died, reportedly from extravagant attempts to cheat death, what followed was less a smooth succession than a brittle interlude. The machinery of control he built didn't vanish overnight, but it showed cracks. Ambitious men saw opportunity. Among them were generals who had learned to burn bridges as a tactic. One of these commanders, fighting for a cause that opposed the imperial center, made a decision that would turn a battlefield into a scene of unimaginable cruelty. At the Battle of Julu, again names and exact numbers are filtered through centuries of retelling, victory and desperation intersected. Supplies were scarce. One rebel general, trying to force a decisive outcome, ordered the burning of his own supply wagons. The logic was harsh but clear: deny your troops the option of retreat, force them to win or die. The maneuver worked as a military gambit. Troops fought with the desperation of men who had lost everything to fall back on. An imperial commander, whether out of loyalty or calculation, chose to surrender rather than face the slaughter of a hopeless fight. According to historical accounts, some 200,000 imperial soldiers were taken prisoner that day. Those figures are drawn from the chronicles of later historians and must be treated with caution. Ancient sources often magnify numbers for rhetorical effect. Still, whether the captive count was 100,000, 200,000, or another large number, the core horror that follows is consistent in the record. Tens of thousands of captured men were marched to a field and ordered to dig. Here's the detail that leaves most readers breathless. Prisoners were allegedly forced to excavate a single, massive pit. Into that pit, they were compelled to throw their weapons and armor. Then, by many accounts, the killing began, either by slaughter or by burial alive, until the noise of the victims was drowned by earth. Some sources describe stones and dirt thrown in until the last cries were muffled. The scale of such an action, if it occurred as described, would have required coordination, manpower, and perhaps most chillingly, the bureaucratic indifference to turn mass murder into a logistical operation. We should be careful at this point. Archaeological confirmation of this specific burial, often associated in modern retellings with a reported discovery in 1912, is unverified. The claim of a mass grave discovered near the site has been contested. Some accounts report finds of human bones and artifacts, while others indicate the evidence is ambiguous or lost. In short, the narrative we have is drawn from historical chronicles and later retellings, and the physical proof remains indefinido in important ways. That uncertainty does not excuse the story. It frames it. Even if exact details blur, the pattern is familiar in the history of warfare. Hunger, surrender, and then a decision by victors or rebels to remove a perceived threat permanently. The cruel irony here is twofold. First, a tactical choice, burning the supply wagons, designed to force victory, instead produced a mass surrender. Second, the policies of a previous ruler, the one who sought total control through draconian methods, helped create the conditions for the uprising. Great power often concentrates the means of mass destruction in fewer hands: armies, administrative apparatuses, and a culture that values order over life. When those instruments are turned inward, when a polity consumes its own people, there is little to stop catastrophe. Imagine the scene in quieter terms. After the clash, men who had been comrades on the battlefield now stooped over a common trench at the command of their captors. Their hands were raw from digging. They watched as armor and swords clinked into the void. The sun set. Evening brought only the sound of shovels, and then the sound of feet. The air, according to the accounts, grew heavy with dust and the smell of sweat and smoke. If the pit was used as a mass execution site, the screams, however loud at first, were buried beneath the din of earth hitting rock. If it was primarily a mass burial to dispose of the dead after a chaotic battle, the result was the same: lives erased, identities flattened into soil. There's another layer of tragedy here worth noting: memory. Landscapes that once absorbed the noise of catastrophe often return to the practical business of life. Fields are ploughed, crops grow where once men fell. The ground will not tell you what it has swallowed unless someone digs, and the political will to dig can be scarce. In some traditions, later generations forget which pieces of land hold which old horrors. Courting the past requires both curiosity and a will to face the stories we would rather leave buried. Some historians have tried to read these episodes as cautionary tales about absolute power. Others emphasize the contingent nature of such tragedies: a shortage of food, a single command to burn supplies, a surrender negotiated under duress. The through line is the same, however. When large social systems break down, ordinary people pay the highest price. There's also an anthropological observation that helps illuminate why such stories endure. Collective violence has a bureaucratic face. Orders are transmitted, men are deputized to carry them out, and the act becomes, perversely, a task to be completed. Dig here, throw this in, move on. That procedural quality makes mass atrocities frighteningly efficient and less contingent upon individual cruelty. It's the system, in other words, that does the most harm. The uncertain archaeological record adds a tension to the story. How much of this is precisely what happened, and how much has been shaped by the needs of later storytellers? We can't answer that definitively, but we can accept the lesson of plausibility, the idea that when a society concentrates power and dehumanizes its opponents, the structural elements for such a massacre are, well, terrifyingly present. So why begin with this account? Because it sets a scale and a frame for what follows. Our second story shrinks the scale from armies and empires to a single person's curiosity, but the mechanics are similar. A small choice or an overlooked hazard meets a set of structures and circumstances that turn error into catastrophe. Both are about human vulnerability in the face of systems, political, environmental, or physical. Imagine a different scene now. Colorado, high in the Rocky Mountains, the air thin and sharp with cold, a landscape of old mines and tangled infrastructure left behind by gold rushes. Now picture a young man, an artist who loved the outdoors, a prospector of sorts, who found pleasure in the abandoned places of that landscape. The shafts, the rusted headframes, the ghost towns where paint had peeled from clapboard houses. His name was Wayne Tease. He was young, talented at painting, and known among friends for a restless curiosity about the old mining country. On April 27, 1986, Wayne went into the hills near Cripple Creek, Colorado. He was with a friend. They hiked in, shared a day of exploration, and then split up for reasons that are indefinido. Small disagreements, a desire to take different routes, or simply the habit of solo wandering that many outdoors people have. Wayne intended a short trip. He had backpacks, an easel maybe, and that attentive eye painters carry for texture and light. The Mary McKinney mine, an abandoned vertical shaft, open and unbarricaded, stood as a relic in the woods, a hole in the earth that had not been closed properly when the rush ended decades earlier. Sometime that afternoon, Wayne didn't return. As evening came and then night, his friend realized that something was wrong and reported him missing. The first response was what you would expect. Neighbors and friends organized a search party. Local officials were called. The terrain was difficult. Steep gullies, old tailings, and a network of shafts that names like Mary McKinney remembered only in scrapbooks and county records. Search teams combed the surface for hours. They called out his name into the pines. At first there was hope that he'd wandered off a trail and fallen asleep. As time stretched, that hope thinned into worry. Rescuers found nothing in the woods. The sun went down. In the morning, professionals from the Bureau of Mines and local land reclamation people arrived with more sophisticated gear. The Mary McKinney shaft posed a terrifying problem. It was a vertical drop, deep enough to make the stomach lurch at the lip. The mine's opening had been left unguarded. In many old mines, water, loose timbers, and steep shafts turn a momentary slip into a death sentence. Search teams lowered a camera down the shaft. The footage, or the summary of it, according to accounts, showed what the worst fears suspected: a human body lodged at some depth between 800 and 1,000 feet down. No one could reach it safely. The shaft was jagged, unstable, and full of hazards. Attempts to rig a safe descent were complicated by old timbers rotted to the point of collapse, and by the simple physics of lowering a person into a vertical tomb. Recovery efforts stretched for days. Professional cave and mine rescuers, volunteer teams, and family members tried to figure how to bring Wayne back. The county and federal agencies argued about liability and safety. For 5 days, people worked with ropes, winches, and plans. The difficulty was not merely technical. There was an ethical limit to what rescuers could risk. Sending a single rescuer into a collapsing shaft to recover a body had in many cases led to additional deaths. The calculus was grim: one life versus one life. Eventually, citing safety concerns and the impracticality of a safe recovery, authorities halted the recovery attempts. Bureaucratic rules, risk assessments, and the lack of a method to retrieve a body from such depth without endangering more lives led to a terrible official decision. The mine would be closed and the site declared a burial place. Local records later reflect that the shaft was sealed and that Wayne's family was informed of the outcome. The sealing of the mine, the closure of a file, and the bureaucratic language do not change the human fact. A family lost a son, and the community was left with a sealed hole in the landscape, and a narrative that refuses neat closure. There are open questions in this story that remain unresolved in the public record. The exact sequence of Wayne's last steps, why he approached that specific shaft, whether there was any visible barrier, whether he slipped on wet rock or missed a step, remains indefinido. Accounts lean toward the likeliest explanation: a misstep near an unguarded shaft. But speculation can only take us so far. The responsibly minded voice in any retelling must emphasize that the known facts are: he was missing. A camera found his body at depth, recovery attempts were attempted and abandoned, and the mine was later sealed. What makes this a horrific destiny in the register of our series isn't merely the death itself, as tragic as that is. It's the way ordinary curiosity and a landscape shaped by industry and neglect combine to produce a permanent absence. Mines that once fed communities now become hazards when left unmanaged. Behind each sealed hole in the ground may be a legal filing, a locked gate, a sign stenciled with warnings, and sometimes a family that bears an absence no regulation can mend. There's a social dimension here too. The rules that protect rescuers are sensible. No one wants to add victim to victim, but those rules can grind against families' instinct to recover their own. Arguments over reopening a site can become proxies for grief. Here, bureaucratic caution intersected with a family's demand for closure, and the state's answer was to seal the wound. The mine is a literal closed chapter in the landscape. If you listen for a moment to what ties this second tale to the first, you'll hear a pattern. Systems, whether empires or industrial regulatory regimes, shape outcomes in unexpected ways. A war policy turns into an execution scenario. An abandoned mine turns a curious afternoon into a sealed grave. In both cases, Ordinary people are swept into mechanics not of their making. Let's return now briefly to a single haunting image. A narrow shaft descending in darkness, shot through with timber and moonlight at the lip. The rescue camera finds a body, motionless, small against the scale of the whole. You can imagine the family watching the footage, the team lowering equipment, the plans drawn up and then abandoned. The practical reasons for stopping are clear. The emotional reasons are not. In that gap between practicality and grief, something lasting forms, a sealed hole in the earth that becomes a kind of memorial and a cautionary tale at once. This is where our narrative pauses, because the truth about such accidents is rarely a single fact, neatly boxed and filed. The human stories, the legal arguments, the small decisions that led to a sealed shaft, they all continue to radiate, affecting friends, families, and policies about abandoned property. But we have already seen the shift in scale that will stay with us for the next story, from armies and mass graves to one man and a vertical shaft. All three of our examples are variations on the same disease of fate. A system amplifies a small error into catastrophe. Before we move on to the third case study, an episode where animal behavior, ecological shock, and human engineering intersect, I want to pause on one more point about these two stories. Whether the deaths were organized at state scale or the tragic end of a lone explorer, three things recur. The fragility of human plans, the dangerous indifference of structures not designed for the person in front of them, and the way memory can be buried, literally and figuratively, unless someone insists on keeping it alive. The third story begins in a different landscape entirely. The flat, heat-baked plains of East Africa, where a railway was cutting its way through wilderness, connecting coast to inland cities. The contractors' camps were temporary, the workers far from home, and the environment here. Not only the animals that lived on it, but the diseases that filtered through herds, was changing. Into this mix walked something unexpected. Two lions that learned, in ways that would horrify the construction crews, to prey on men. But before we step into that savannah and into the notes of John Henry Patterson's campaign against those lions, there are context and threads we must set up. The railway's ambition, the vulnerability of migrant workers, and the environmental pressures at play. These are not as simple as monster versus man tales. They are stories of ecology, injury, and opportunity. The story as often told centers on a British lieutenant named John Henry Patterson, who was assigned to oversee construction and later became, by his own account and by the popular retellings, the man who defeated the man-eating lions. He arrived to a scene thick with fear, workers disappearing from camp at night, bodies found torn and decapitated, men refusing to sleep in the tents where they once camped. Rumors spread. Superstition filled gaps in knowledge. Some whispered of witchcraft or of malevolent spirits. Patterson, for his part, took a pragmatic approach at first. Follow the tracks, gather evidence, and mount a hunt. When he arrived at the scene, he found tracks and signs inconsistent with a human killer. He found, according to his narrative and to the accounts that have circulated since, evidence that pointed to two large male lions, remains in camps, signs of nocturnal stalking, and the terrifying possibility that the animals had developed a taste, or a habit, for human flesh. The pattern of kills offered grim-like details, but also forensic clues. Bodies found in tents, remains apparently dragged and disarticulated, within the framework of a garrisoned construction site where men slept in temporary housing and where corpses might be left exposed after disease-stricken cattle died nearby. The presence of scavenging opportunities and the breakdown of normal foraging patterns created an ecological situation ripe for behavioral change. Patterson undertook a series of measures: patrols at night, fortified bomas, and eventually a hunt to kill the offending animals. He shot two lions that he believed were responsible and later brought their bodies back as proof. In his published account, he claimed a very high death toll, numbers that later retellings amplified as a part of the legend. Modern researchers, applying more critical methods and census techniques, have suggested lower death tolls, estimates that vary into the dozens rather than the hundreds. A recent wave of forensic investigation, teethwear studies and diet analysis of the lion's remains has complicated the story in useful ways. Dental trauma in the lions and evidence of mixed diet indicate that these animals might have been driven to seek unusual prey by injury and ecological collapse, not by an inherent malevolence. That point matters. The Tsavo case, as it's often called, sits at the juncture of myth and science. On the one hand, the image of two imperial lions bringing a railway project to its knees is a potent, almost cinematic tale. On the other, modern inquiry suggests a more prosaic, less villainous mechanism. Environment and injury reshaping predator behavior, and tragedy unfolding as human infrastructure intersected with a disrupted ecosystem. Each of these three stories, state-organized mass killing, a prospector's fall into an abandoned shaft, and a series of lion attacks, feels different at the surface. But beneath that surface, they share the same anatomy of catastrophe. A human plan meets an unforgiving system. That theme will shape the remainder of our session as we peel back the details of the Tsavo events and then reflect on what these destinies tell us about chance, responsibility, and memory. At this moment, as we stand on the edge of the Tsavo story, something else worth noting appears: the way evidence and narrative interplay. For the ancient burial, the archaeological record is ambiguous and reports of discovery contested. For Wayne T's, the camera footage provided a brutal, decisive image, but retrieving the body proved impossible. For the lions, Patterson's witness account created a legend. Later, forensic work recontextualized it. In each case, the record is a palimpsest. Oral accounts overwrite physical claims, scientific inquiry revises earlier narratives, and the popular imagination sometimes prefers the dramatic retelling. We'll return to the savannah and follow Patterson through his patrols and his eventual confrontation with the animals. We'll examine the kinds of forensic evidence that modern researchers have used to reconsider the death toll and the behavioral drivers behind man-eating. And we'll look at how museums and collectors preserved the remains, skins, skulls, and stories, turning tragedy into relic and sometimes into spectacle. But before that, take a moment to reflect on what you're watching unfold here. Three narratives with very different scales and time frames, but with a shared logic. Power structures, neglected infrastructure, and ecological stress are not abstract. They produce human outcomes. Those outcomes are often messy, debated, and morally fraught. They demand that we be precise about what we claim and generous in our empathy toward those whose names have been lost. We'll pick up the Tsavo narrative in more depth next, starting with the first reports of missing men and the early evidence that convinced Patterson to move from skepticism to action. There's an element of detective work here that resembles the mine camera in Colorado, a piece of evidence that forces a decision. In Tsavo, the evidence is tracks and torn tent canvas and the pattern of the attacks. But there's a question that will run through the rest of the story. Were these lions monstrous by nature, or were they animals pushed into an unnatural niche by wounds, disease, and ecological collapse? Modern research provides clues, but, as with the other stories, the full truth resists easy categorization. The first missing tracks were small things at first. A torn tent flap here, a smear of blood on a cot there. Men who had slept soundly were gone in the morning. Some bodies were found half-eaten under the stars. Others were simply not there, vanished between the lamp and the latrine. At the time, the crew at Tsavo, temporary camps strung along a railway line cleaving through scrub and acacia, were a workforce on the margins, migrant laborers paid for a harsh, seasonal labor that put them far from home and easy to overlook. The environment was a place of extremes, and those extremes were changing. When John Henry Patterson arrived, he stepped into a scene thick with rumors. Some believed spirits or sorcery. Others whispered that colonial officials were to blame somehow. Poor planning, inadequate food, a failure to protect labor. Patterson's account, written later and told with the confidence of someone who could turn a story into a book, framed the events as a problem of predation. Two unusually bold male lions had begun to hunt men. He described a set of grisly scenes, tent interiors in shreds, blood on bedrolls, corpses dragged and partially consumed, but he also described methodical detective work. He tracked prints, set watches, and tried to reconstruct how the attacks were occurring. There are a few images that stick in the popular memory of Tsavo. One is of the lions, large-maned males, slipping through moonlight and human light, moving with that uncanny feline silence that makes a camp seem suddenly exposed. Another is of the night watches, men sitting in improvised towers or under lanterns, their rifles across their knees, listening for the rustle of grass and the low exhaled warning of a predator. Those who kept vigil learned the sound of danger, two small noises in the dark, and lived to tell the tale. Patterson employed a range of defensive measures. He organized patrols, increased lighting, and strengthened enclosures around the camp. He experimented with snares and traps. He and his men staked out sites with bait in an effort to lure the animals into the open. The narrative that grew up around the campaign reads like an imperial adventure. A lone, determined officer, facing down two beasts that had turned the landscape into a corridor of fear. But the reality, like so many human stories, was messier. Working conditions around the camps had changed in the years before the attacks. Colonial expansion, the introduction of livestock, and outbreaks of disease among cattle, most notably rinderpest in the region, had altered the food web. Dead cattle and weakened herds created opportunities for scavengers. Contemporary observers and later analysts have suggested that wounded or old lions, unable to bring down their usual prey, might turn to easier sources of protein. Human bodies, in some contexts, are sadly abundant, poorly protected and accessible, especially when infrastructure is thin and people sleep in temporary shelters. There's another detail that modern researchers have emphasized: dental trauma. Lions with broken or worn teeth may find it difficult to process tough hide and sinew from their typical prey. A lion with damaged canines or cracked incisors is at a disadvantage when confronting a wildebeest or zebra. But a sleeping human in a flimsy tent represents a soft, convenient morsel. A study, recent and one of several efforts to reassess older narratives, found evidence suggestive of dental injury and a mixed diet in the specimens associated with the Tsavo lions. The suggestion is not sensationalism, it's plausible biology. It offers a mechanistic explanation that moves the story away from metaphors of monstrosity and toward an understanding of how ecological pressure and individual vulnerability can redirect predator behavior. That said, facts about the number of victims remain unsettled. Patterson's account is dramatic and has been enormously influential, but his toll, one of the larger figures associated with the story, has been questioned. Later researchers combed through colonial records, payrolls, and burial registers and proposed lower figures. Estimates vary. Some modern work suggests dozens rather than the hundreds Patterson reported. Other analyses allow for a range. Higher numbers might be possible if record-keeping was incomplete or if missing men were not formally documented. The safest position is to say that the death toll is disputed. Patterson claimed a very high number. Later scrutiny suggests a lower but still tragic count. That caveat matters because it shifts how we read the episode, from an epic of horror to a tragedy shaped by environmental dynamics and the faults of imperial record-keeping. The narrative of the hunt that ended with two carcasses pinned against a tree is as much about performance as it is about predation. When Patterson eventually shot the lions, he preserved their skins and skulls. Those items, like many objects retrieved from violent episodes, became proof and relic. They were trophies in a literal sense, but they also functioned as evidence in a story that needed closure. Museums and private collectors later became custodians of those remains. The animals were transformed, carefully skinned, stretched, taxidermied, into objects that could be displayed and read by visitors far from the original site. That process raises ethical questions. Who owns a story? Whose grief is translated into a museum label? And how does turning an animal into an exhibit shape our moral understanding of what happened? Patterson, for his part, wrote an account that became both a bestseller and a staple of late Victorian adventure literature. It fed the public appetite for frontier heroics and for stories in which a single man could impose order on a chaotic world. Later retellings, novels, films, museum placards, leaned into that narrative. Yet, as the forensic work suggests, the more prosaic causes, injury, disease, ecological stress, are at least as compelling and far less comforting to the simple moral of hunter versus beast. There's a third human element in the Tsavo story that's easy to overlook: The workers themselves. Many were migrants from distant regions, drawn by wage labor. Their lives mattered less in the ledger books of colonial projects. Payrolls rarely show the cost of fear, or the psychological toll of living under a sky where your tent could be checked by a predator each night. When we reduce the episode to lions and a hunter, we risk effacing the daily lived reality of the laborers, fathers who left families behind, men who navigated languages and cultures to earn a wage, and communities whose members simply did not return. Consider also the response of the colonial authorities. Some protected camps more effectively than others. Some officers read the events through the lens of superstition and sought spiritual answers. Others took the problem as a logistical or engineering challenge. The mix of responses shaped how many lives were saved and how many were lost. Institutional weakness, lack of consistent patrols, insufficient fortifications, and a supply line that could not easily be rerouted magnified the danger. After the lions were killed, their skins and skulls entered narratives that were sometimes celebratory and sometimes exploitative. They toured as curiosities. They sat in halls of empire as objects that testified to a supposed triumph of civilization over savagery. Modern curators and scientists have tried to reclaim the story from spectacle, situating the events in a framework of ecology and epidemiology. Museums now face the task of explaining not only the drama, but the context, that these animals were part of an ecosystem under stress, and that the people affected were working in conditions shaped by imperial priorities. The Tsavo episode, like the other two stories we've examined, shows how a constellation of factors, individual injury, environmental collapse, weak institutional frameworks, can create a spiral of tragedy. In the case of Tsavo, the line between predator and victim blurred because both sides were under stress. The lions were not calculating monsters, they were animals struggling in an altered landscape. The workers were not simply heroic victims, they were human beings exposed by economic systems and by the practical limits of colonial protection. There are small human moments in the records that underline this complexity. Men who kept night watches were sometimes praised for their bravery. Other times they were criticized for failing to maintain discipline. Names of victims linger in fragmentary lists, payrolls, cemetery logs, even oral recollections in descendant communities. The human cost, even if precisely uncounted, is present in these traces. And the broader pattern that animals, infrastructure, and social systems can align to produce unexpected horrors repeats across time and place. By the time Patterson's account became widely known, the Tsavo story had entered the popular imagination as an emblem of wrong place, wrong time. But modern reinterpretations remind us to be skeptical of singular narratives. They encourage us to look for causes that are systemic, rather than metaphysical. They also ask us to remember the people who do not become protagonists in published books. The laborer not counted in a payroll, the family whose loss went unrecorded, the workers who continued to build the line even as fear stalked their nights. If you step back and compare the three cases we've covered, the alleged mass burial after Julu, the sealed shaft in Colorado, and the man-eating lions of Tsavo, a few themes stand out clearly. The first is contingency. Small decisions or accidents can produce outsized outcomes when systems are fragile. Burning supply wagons, a misstep near an unguarded shaft, an outbreak that weakens a food web. Each of these seems small in the moment, but each feeds into larger dynamics that produce catastrophe. The second is institutional response. When institutions fail, or when their response is limited by practicality or ideology, ordinary people bear the cost. In ancient times, bureaucratic or military machinery could be turned toward mass killing. In modern bureaucracies, rules meant to protect rescuers can result in mines being sealed with bodies unsalvaged. The third is the tension between myth and evidence. Dramatic narratives travel faster and lodge more firmly in public memory than careful, often less satisfying, explanations based on ecology or economics. There is, too, a moral component. We tend to frame such episodes as exceptional, monsters visited upon the innocent, or rulers or generals who overreach. But it's equally true that ordinary structures of power, ordinary neglect, and ordinary environmental shifts can produce similar outcomes, without any single individual being uniquely villainous. The machinery of harm is often diffuse. That insight should complicate our search for blame and sharpen our attention to prevention. What does prevention look like in such different contexts? In the case of ancient mass violence, prevention is political, checks on central power, protections for surrendered combatants, and cultural norms that limit cruelty. In the case of abandoned mines, prevention is regulatory, safe closure practices, better record-keeping, and site remediation that anticipates long-term hazards. In the case of human-wildlife conflict, prevention is ecological and managerial, maintaining herd health, minimizing scavenging opportunities near human camps, and building infrastructure that recognizes animals' needs as well as humans. None of these are easy, none are foolproof. But thinking in systemic terms helps us identify where interventions might work. There's also an ethical obligation in how we remember and retell these stories. Memory can be restorative when it insists on the humanity of victims and when it resists turning tragedy into mere spectacle. Museums that display animal skins and skulls can do so in ways that foreground context and scientific humility rather than triumphalism. Historians who narrate ancient massacres can highlight the limits of the record while still honoring the human cost. Families of those lost in mines deserve a kind of procedural compassion in official responses, transparent explanations, engagement with recovery options, and sensitivity to the emotional dimensions of closure. If there's a single piercing lesson these stories leave us with, it is this. Being in the wrong place at the wrong time is never merely a phrase. It is often the product of layered causes, some accidental and some systemic, and it demands not only empathy, but also structural thinking. Horror in the historical register is not only the work of isolated malice, it is frequently the result of ordinary arenas where power, neglect, and nature intersect. So where does that leave us? With a sober awareness that history's most horrific destinies are rarely pure mysteries and rarely mere fate. They are the sum of choices, some conscious, some delegated to systems, and of material realities that accumulate until tragedy becomes possible. They call on us to interpret them carefully, to honor the human lives affected, and to resist the simplifications that make us comfortable. If this episode left you wanting to dig deeper, there are threads to follow. You can look into the way imperial projects altered ecosystems, the modern protocols for mine closure and rescue, and the forensic methods that help us interpret animal diets and injuries centuries later. Each of those fields offers tools for preventing future tragedies, or at least for understanding how they arise. If you found this worth your time, I'd appreciate it if you'd subscribe to the channel. There's a link to our Patreon if you want to support longer research efforts and get early access to bonus material. I also run a story suggestion form that helps shape future episodes. If you have a case you think fits this theme of fate and system, send it in. We try to pick stories that let us pry open larger patterns while keeping an eye on individual lives. Thanks for listening through these difficult tales. They're uncomfortable, and they should be. Remembering and understanding what happened is a way of honoring those whose destinies ended in ways none of us would choose. If you're up for it, I'll see you in the next deep dive, where we'll look at another corner of history and try to make sense of how ordinary moments become catastrophic ends.